And for the sake of time, you leave some things out. You can press it down, but it's the same story. Or is it? Maybe you're telling a story and you're telling it to someone who already knows the people, so you leave out some of the names and such just because they would be able to figure it out on their own, whereas if you're telling it to someone else, you have to go into more detail. It's the same story. Or is it? What if the thrust of the story is different? What if the purpose behind the story is different? Maybe in one sense you tell the story to be funny, but in another sense you tell it to be dramatic. Is it the same story? Tonight we're looking at 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles is the same story. In fact, it's really the exact same story as what we read in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. It's just another history. And if you read through it, you're going to find yourself saying, wait, haven't we heard this already? But yet, at the same time, it's different. Even the author acknowledges in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 1, that the things were written in the books of the kings of the Israel. The story that's written here is the same story, but yet it's from a different perspective. The book covers the same material, but it does it in a different way. You see, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings cover the history of the Israelites, but so does 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel are written more as just a history. It's just telling all the events that happened. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles is written to a different people at a different time. It's written to the people after captivity, after these events. It's written to the people of the return, a people who have been defeated and broken and taken away and are now coming back to their homeland. It's a history written not just to inform, but to inspire, to let those people know that there is something good about where they came from and who they were. The stories that are written here are written to emphasize that. And we see that the author fully acknowledges that his history isn't the only history. In 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 15, he says, the acts of Rehoboam from first to last, were they not written in the records of Shemaiah the prophet and Iddo the seer according to the genealogical enrollment? In other words, he says the events that happened here, you can read elsewhere. He's covering them from a limited perspective for a reason. He's not going into all the negative detail that he has to, but rather his history is focused on accentuating the positive. Now the question is this whitewashing history? Is this trying to take away all the bad and just make it seem like everything was good? You know, for years we have seen a movement that has done that in American history. American history, so many of the founding fathers, so many things where all the good things were said about them, and we didn't tell them in full detail. And now we've kind of gone the other way, where we look at them all as bad and awful. And where's the truth? Is this just trying to smooth the edges to make the people feel better? Not really, because it's not if the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles doesn't talk about those things. No, he tells of the failures, but he doesn't dwell on them. In fact, when he tells these stories, you can tell that he's doing it for the lesson, for them, the understanding. He has that positive spin, right? He cites the sources. He doesn't try to hide history, but rather he's focusing on the aspects of the story that will help the new people, the new refugees that have come home the most. Oftentimes we see him just sum up the bad. In 1 Chronicles, we see that. In 1 Chronicles chapter 10 and verses 13 and 14, he talks about Saul there. And he said, Saul died for the trespasses which he committed for the Lord, because of the word of the Lord he did not keep. Also he asked the council of Medium to make inquiry of it, and he did not inquire of the Lord. There he killed him and turned the kingdom to David the son of Jesse. Here dealing with Saul, he just basically says, well, Saul didn't do what was right. So he's not covering it up. He's just not focusing on it. In fact, one of the oddities you'll see when you read this book is the first 9 chapters of the book don't deal with anything other than a genealogy. Now, as a reader there, you might be trapped into thinking, I don't want to read this book. It's just a list of names, right? It's just a list of all the tribes and all the people and all the priests. And as you go through it for those 9 chapters, you can think, what's the point? But to do so, you have to understand why it's starting there. Because God's people have not been forgotten. This last summer, we went to Washington, D.C. We walked in all the monuments that were there, the Vietnam War Memorial, the Korean War Memorial. And as you go to those memorials, usually you'll see lists of names of soldiers who died. And it's very easy to walk by and just think, oh, that's terrible, but to move on. But years ago, I heard someone give the advice when you go there. They said, go to the records and look for either somebody who has your same last name. If you don't know anyone personally, go find someone who has your last name, or go find someone from your hometown and go find their name in the memorial. It's interesting how it changes your perspective to look at a name of someone who lives in your town, who may be someone in your family tree. That list of names changes meaning, right? The list of names was to show the people that God was with them. And it tells their stories, but it does so in a way to inspire. For example, when the story of David and Uzzah are told, it's a story of tragedy, right? They're trying to bring the ark back and they don't do it properly. And Uzzah dies because of it. But in Chronicles, it uses that not just to tell of the tragedy, but to understand what went wrong and how to make it right. 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 13, because you did not carry it at first, the Lord our God made an outburst for us, and we did not seek him according to the ordinance. So the priests and Levites consecrated themselves to bring the ark of the Lord of God before Israel. And then it goes on to tell about the celebration that comes when they do it right. It doesn't hide the story, but yet it uses the story to emphasize how they fixed the problem and how they learned from it. Over and over, you'll see that. The book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles doesn't tell us much about the northern kingdom. 2 Chronicles 10:19 sums it up and says, so Israel has been in rebellion to the house of David to that day. Because most of those kings were bad. Most of the things they did, all those kings were bad, and most of the things they did were no good. Chronicles just mentions it and moves on. Rather, it tends to focus on the good kings of the south. Specifically, the 8 good kings and what they did and what they were able to accomplish. In essence, it gives a profiles and courage to the men who showed their faith in God. For people who've known their history and known the bad, he wants to emphasize and show them, but here's the people that stood out. People like Asa in chapters 14 and 16, as he cleaned up the land from its idolatry. Jehoshaphat in chapters 17 through 20, who helped organize the worship of God. Josiah, who refurbished the temple in chapters 23 and 24. Hezekiah in chapters 22 through 32, the great reformer, who stood in the midst of a great crisis and brought the people through and back to God. And Josiah, the complete reformer who pulled out the idols of the temple and brought Israel back in a time before they were falling apart. This good king comes in and makes a difference. These stories they're important. But why? Why is it important for people to know their history? Why was it important for these Israelites at this time, as they're going in and rebuilding their kingdom, to know God still remembered them, to know the things that went right, to learn from those mistakes? Sometimes I have seen in my ministry, you'll have those people that will come and say, well, we just need New Testament books. We just need to study the New Testament. It's New Testament church. We don't need any of those things. And it always greatly concerns me when someone says that. That's almost like saying, you can just eat this one thing and get all you need from it, so why would you have anything else, I think because there's so much more. There's so much more flavor. There's so much more to learn. But specifically, when you look at these old books, these these histories, they tell us about ourselves by the things that they go through. We can learn, in essence, from their example. A great example of that in the text is in 2 Chronicles chapter 15. In verses 1 through 7 there, we see King Asa and how the prophet comes to him and says, "Listen to me, Asa, and all Judea and Benjamin, the Lord is with you when you are with him. And if you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. For in many days Israel was without the true God, and without a teaching, and priest, and without the law. And in their distress they turned to the Lord God of Israel, and they sought him, and he let them find him. In those times there was no peace of him. They went out to him who came in, and many disturbances affected the inhabitants of the land. The nations were crushed by nations, cities by cities. But God troubled them with all kinds of distress. But you, be strong, and do not lose courage, for there is reward in your work." See, Asa was one of those men who was trying to bring his people back to a point in time. And the prophet comes and tells him, look, if you seek God, he'll let you find him. If you go to God, he'll be there for him. But if you turn from God, he will forsake you. You see, in essence, that's the story of Chronicles. That's the story that we need to get. An understanding that if we look through the history of God in dealing with his people, if we look at all the things that God has done, we can see from their mistakes and from their victories what we should and shouldn't do. We can understand how to find God and how to seek God and how to be rewarded by God, and how those that do turn and follow him, they find a better way. It's only when we gain that knowledge, when we look to that law, that we can find God all the more. And so I think as these people needed their history, so do we as well. You'll notice in 1st and 2nd Chronicles that so oftentimes history talks about wars and conflict. I mean, we see that, right? We see these battles. We see these turning points, right? We see these events that take place, and that seems to be our focus, but they tend to forget that that's the exception, right? That's the outliers and not the day-to-day life. But yet in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we don't see as much focus on those things. Rather, the emphasis is on worship. The emphasis on the temple, the priest, the relationship of people to their God. I mean, in 1 Chronicles in chapters 23 through 26, we have once again one of those long periods of naming names, right? And here it's naming all the Levites and all the priests and all the musicians that serve and the gatekeepers. And then it turns to the treasurers and then the military and then the leaders. It's almost as if he's making a point in just how he lists them, right? The people that come first, he said, let the people that draw us closer to God, the people that help us worship God, the people who help those things happen. He doesn't forget about those other things, but yet there seems to be a focus, right? The focus is, it's not going to be your kings that save you. It's not going to be your military might that saves you. All those things failed you in the past. But it's your relationship to God. It's your service of him. That's what you need to look back and remember, because that's what's going to shape your future. A great example of this is in 2 Chronicles chapter 30. Here it tells the story of Hezekiah and his efforts to reinstitute the Passover feast. Hezekiah is one of those great figures from history. The events that go on in Hezekiah are the most covered events of the Bible, with maybe the exception of the life of Christ in the Gospels. But even there, you have the 4 Gospels and that's it. Whereas Hezekiah is talked about in the books of Kings, but he's also talked about in Chronicles and Isaiah. There are outside sources that cover the exact same events. But yet, Chronicles focuses just as much on bringing back the Passover. In Chronicles 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verse 1, it says, "Now Hezekiah went to Israel and Judah and wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover of the Lord God of Israel." Hezekiah says we need to get back to celebrating these commanded feasts, and it starts here with the Passover. In verse 4 it says, "And these things were right in the sight of the king and all the assembly." They looked and said, it's the right thing that we need to be doing. Now that doesn't mean everybody was on board. In verse 10 it says, "So the couriers passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh and as far as Zebulun, but they laughed at them to scorn and mocked them." You see, as he sent this word out and said, we all want you to come to the Passover, we all want to celebrate this feast, there were plenty of people, and there's always those people who were like, we don't need to be doing that. That's too much effort to go down to Jerusalem to worship. We haven't done that in years. That's part of the old way. There's too much going on. But Hezekiah had a vision, right, for his people, to draw them back to the worship of God. And even with the naysayers, even with the people who mocked, verse 12 it says, "The hand of the Lord was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princesses commanded by the word of the Lord." What is it telling us? That the hand of God was there. And the hand of God was giving them one heart to obey those leaders. Why? Because they were doing what was commanded by the word of the Lord. I don't know about you, but that's an inspirational idea. That if we draw ourselves to the commandment of God, that God will help our efforts. That God will help change hearts and draw people to the thing that is right and good. What a world today that needs to be drawn to God. And people that need to be reminded how much we need Him. What an amazing idea. Verse 26, it talks about that day. It says, "So there was great joy in Jerusalem, because there was nothing like this in Jerusalem since the days of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel." Well, they hadn't done anything like that in a long time. It's interesting because Chronicles wants us to know that event. Wants us to understand what God had in mind for His people then and what God will have in the mind for them in the future, because that's really what the book is emphasizing. You know, sometimes to move forward, you need to look back. In order to go where you need to go, you need to start by looking at where you came from, how you got where you are, and what you can learn from it in order to grow. As we said earlier, the book of 2 Chronicles is telling the story of the history of Israel from a positive perspective, emphasizing what they did to overcome their mistakes, those kings and leaders who drew them closer to God, because they, in chapter 36, verse 22, were moving into a new era. It says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he sent a proclamation throughout the kingdom and also put in writing, saying, 'Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me and all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Whoever there is among you of his people, may the Lord God be with him, and let him go up.'" They were on the precipice of history. A new history, a new opportunity, a chance for them to go and become the people of God again. Not the exiles who had been taken into captivity, not those who had been punished for the wickedness of generations, but a new chance, a new opportunity that God was giving them through this foreign king to go and fulfill God's promises. To rebuild, to start anew, to start something, and to start with a philosophy and idea that we are going to go with God. The book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles may be one of those that as we read it, we may be tempted to say, well, I don't need it. It's a bunch of genealogies. It's a bunch of names. It's a bunch of history of people that don't matter to me. But really what it is, it's the story of how God continues to work, even through our failures, even through our mistakes. That God's hand is still working. He doesn't forget his people. He doesn't abandon them. But he does inspire them. He does give them hope. He does give them something that they can look back to that will help them move forward. In Romans chapter 15, verse 4, we read, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of Scriptures, we might have hope." You know, we have another passage in 1 Corinthians that uses something similar. It says those people were written as an example so that we won't do the things that they did. They were bad examples. But here, Paul says these things were written, what? For our instructions, to give us perseverance and encouragement, that we might have hope. Because we can look back and see what God was doing then. And it helps us to see what God is doing now. We can look back and learn that even in their mistakes, there was a way to set things right. That when the leaders led, when the people followed, when they turned their hearts to God, they found great things. Great things can still be found for us today. We'll do the same thing. What do they tell the king? If you seek God, he'll let you find him. God's not far from us, but he is waiting for us to look. So many times we're focused on so many other things that we forget to look and see who God is and what he's doing. Sometimes it's easier to look back and see all the things that he did. And that helps open our eyes to what he can do for us today. If God didn't abandon his people even in their sin, he won't abandon you either. But he has a plan for you. If you seek him, you'll find him. But if you forsake him, he'll forsake you. Really similar to what Jesus told us, right? If you confess me, I'll confess you before my Father. But if you deny me, I'll deny you before my Father. If we seek him in belief, if we turn from the thing that destroyed us, if we put him first in confession, if we follow his plan, we have hope. We have a future. We have a chance to do something we haven't seen in a long time. But if we forget about it, we forget about what he's done, we forget about what he's telling us, we'll find ourselves on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of the events, of those who are forgotten and those who aren't remembered anymore. See, in Israel, we see the wrong side of the coin, those who just stayed in rebellion. We also see those who came back to God and how he can restore them and he can rebuild and he can do something great. Maybe tonight you need to let God do something in your life by turning to him. Tonight might be your chance to obey the gospel, to show the Lord that you have heard his word and that you are seeking him and are doing his will. Maybe as a Christian, you've forgotten those things, and it's time to be reminded again of what God can do. If you're subject to the invitation, we offer you a chance to let that need be known right now while we stand and sing.